The situation in the border areas of Sumy and Kharkiv regions is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. At the staff meeting, President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the soldiers for their resilience and discussed the key needs of each direction and unit.
It is very important that the nature of the situation in the border areas of Sumy and Kharkiv regions is determined by our units. I would especially like to mention the 225th Assault Regiment, the 71st Separate Jaeger Brigade, and our Special Operations Forces units. Thank you, Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, Facebook.
The soldiers report that they are destroying all the small Russian infantry groups that their commanders throw into so-called meat assaults, unsuccessfully trying to break through the Ukrainian defense. The defenders emphasize that every time, the enemy fails their physical training test spectacularly, or more precisely, with a bang.
So right now, their approach is basically, well, if this soldier gets killed, they'll just send a new one. In fact, many of them don't even have the objective to actually engage in combat, so to speak, or to break through our defenses or capture our strong points. For many, the only task is simply to push as far forward as possible, take up a position, and wait for someone else to arrive.
According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in the Kramatorsk direction, Ukrainian soldiers repelled 2 Russian attacks, as well as 4 each in the Siversk and southern Slobozansky directions, and 5 each in the northern Slobozansky, Kursk, Kupiansk, and Toretsk sectors of the front. According to the soldiers, all the Russian equipment that the enemy tries to bring in for their attacks quickly turns into scrap metal. The defenders also spoke about another daring operation in the city of Toretsk. There, the building of an old swimming pool was destroyed. This is a strategically important site that could have ended up under the control of the Russian occupiers. To plant the explosives, the sappers, under the cover of armored vehicles, went right up to the front line. The operation was extremely complex and risky.
The weather was on our side from the start. There was such a thick fog that it actually lifted our spirits, and we were sure that everything would work out for us. We went in and thoroughly inspected the premises, even went down into the basements. After all, we understood that we couldn't let the enemy in there, because then they'd have a very secure foothold to build up their forces. And the result was unexpectedly spectacular.
The enemy tried to attack 9 times in the Novopovlivka direction. There, our soldiers repelled Russian assaults near 4 settlements. Another 17 attacks by Russian occupiers were repelled in the Lyman sector. The situation remains difficult in the Pokrovsk direction. There, 24 unsuccessful attempts by the Russians to push Ukrainian defenders from their positions were thwarted.
So, if you look at it, the whole front is on fire, burning. But what's notable is that the defense forces are shifting to a tactic of active defense. This is extremely important because whoever holds the initiative controls the battlefield. Seizing the initiative from the enemy is now, in general, the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces of Ukraine.
A single precise strike by Ukrainian soldiers deprived the Russians of AT-80 tank, which they had hidden in a forest belt, hoping to use it for a possible breakthrough. Another target was destroyed in the Lyman direction. There, a Ukrainian FPV drone flew through a long stretch of forest and hit a Zu-23 with pinpoint accuracy. This is a Soviet anti-aircraft gun that the occupiers used to target aerial threats at low altitudes. And on the Zaporizhia section of the front, the Russians lost an engineering remote mining system called Zemlodeli, which was spectacularly blown up by operators from Ukraine's unmanned systems forces.
A skilled FPV crew is all it takes. A single FPV crew can stop a mechanized infantry assault with vehicles. That's the importance of unmanned systems units for you.
890 Russian occupiers were eliminated by Ukraine's defense forces over the past day. Thus, the total combat losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion have already exceeded 1,077,000 soldiers. In addition, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, for Russian tanks, 3 armored fighting vehicles, more than 30 artillery systems, and nearly 100 units of automotive and special equipment were destroyed yesterday.
So, we'll be discussing the Frontline agenda with our guest. Denis Popovich, military analyst, is already connected with us. Hello, Denis.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Denis, I'd like to clarify something regarding this information. This isn't the first time. Well, let's say several times now they've been putting the cart before the horse. And of course, the Russian occupiers are spreading information that they've supposedly captured something there. But in reality, at most, some sabotage and reconnaissance groups break through, and then they run back out. In other words, Ukrainian forces drive them out. How do you see it? Why is it that right now, in these directions in the Dnipropetrovsk region, there's so much attention, let's say, and not just from the Russian occupiers, with this kind of information that they're supposedly capturing some villages there?
Well, you have to understand that this is a flag planting practice on the part of the Russian occupiers. That is, they infiltrate either as small assault groups or as sabotage and reconnaissance teams. They enter certain settlements they consider important, set up their flag there, take photos or record videos if they have time to do so. Well, after that, they send this information to their Telegram channels or somewhere else. And then their commanders can drill a star, an opening for a star, on their shoulder boards or for an award. There's information that if they enter a settlement like this, they get leave as a reward. That's why it's beneficial for them to stage these flag planting events. After that, these flags are either destroyed, and the sabotage group itself can also be eliminated. In reality, there is no control over this or that settlement, but nevertheless, they manage to report that, so to speak, they control it. Although in fact, this is like taking territory on credit, and it doesn't reflect the real situation at all. They just want to get a reward, a vacation, or some other kind of incentive, and so on. And this practice is very widespread, especially lately. Why are they so eager to get to the Dnipropetrovsk region? Well, that's not a secret either. They want to reach the administrative borders of Donetsk region to get to the junction of three regions, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk. That's when we're talking about the southern Donetsk direction. They want to go beyond the borders of Dnipropetrovsk region in order to seize more territory and have a stronger position in negotiations.
Denis, how would you assess the situation today in Donetsk region, in Zaporizhia region, which was discussed at the meeting with the president and the military? Of course, these directions received the main focus. And, nevertheless, of course, the other directions were discussed as well. And I'm interested in your opinion on what tactics the Russian occupation army might use going forward. If before they used the tactic of these multiple cuts, thousands of cuts, millions of cuts, it's been called different things, how do you think the enemy will act next? Right now, all their actions are really concentrated in these two regions, for the most part, and as a result, the occupiers are paying less attention to the North Slobozhenskaya area at the moment, having definitely been dealt a blow by our defenders. What do you think? How will the enemy behave next?
Do you mean where they will try to advance, or how they will try to advance?
What tactics, in fact, might the enemy use going forward, or will this tactic of multiple cuts continue as before?
Well, right now they have a tactic that they consider successful for themselves, and in principle, it really does bring them certain advantages. We can see that they are making advances. In particular, this tactic brought them advantages during their attempt to infiltrate the Dobropilia area. If you recall, about 2 weeks ago there was such a situation, but now we have recaptured that breakthrough. So, it's this infiltration, small infantry groups, 2 or 3 people each, but there are a lot of these groups. Their task is not so much to engage in battle and breakthrough, but rather to bypass our, strongholds, so to speak, right? That is, our posts, our strong points, and so on. Taking advantage of the fact that the front line is thinly held, there isn't a continuous line of defense for various reasons, including a shortage of infantry. Well, this is also due to the overall change in the nature of combat and the dominance of drones on the battlefield. So the defensive line now doesn't look like what we, let's say, are used to seeing, like in World War I or World War II. It's more of a sparse, let's say, porous environment. Right, if I can put it that way. And the enemy is taking advantage of this. They bypass our posts, bypass our strong points, gather forces, and in this way, they build up strength, and then, so to speak, they end up appearing behind our lines. That's exactly what happened in the Dobropilia area. They use camouflage for this. They use the features of the terrain for this. They use tree lines and so on, right? So that's the kind of tactic they're using now. At the same time, these infantry groups aren't very well controlled with drones. They stay in contact with individual officers. These groups are well trained specifically to carry out this kind of march. It's this kind of infiltration, sneaking in, slipping through, and so on. So, obviously, they're going to keep using this kind of tactic. Why? Because, honestly, the shortage of infantry is, unfortunately, a pretty serious issue on our side.
Dennis, I'd also like to clarify. Of course, the most intense and heated fighting is still happening in the Pokrovsk direction, but nevertheless, in the Lyman direction, the enemy has amassed a large number of infantry. The situation there is tense as well, and the task of the Russian occupiers is to advance as far and as deep as possible. Thus, for Ukrainian defenders, the main source of tension is, of course, the need to stay highly focused and constantly monitor the enemy's movements, said Maxim Belousov, a representative of the 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade. And also, according to him, the enemy is constantly replenishing its reserves with inexperienced soldiers. Supposedly, just a month after signing the contract, Russians are sent to the front lines, which naturally leads to further casualties. So why are they building up troops in the Lyman direction, and with such inexperienced recruits at that?
Well, for them, it's important right now to build up numbers. In other words, they're trying to attack with sheer numbers. And for them, at this point, it's not so important that these people are well trained. A month is actually pretty good. Your interviewee mentioned that a month is actually a decent amount of time. The training period can be much shorter. It could be a week, 10 days, or 2 weeks. So right now, training doesn't matter to them at all. What matters to them is numbers and constantly trying to put pressure on our positions. Their current approach is basically, if this soldier gets killed, they'll just send in a new one. That's how they're trying to operate. That's why training isn't that important to them. In fact, many of them don't even have the goal of engaging in combat, breaking through our defenses, or capturing our strongpoints. A lot of them just have the task of advancing as far as possible, taking a position, and waiting for reinforcements. So they don't even necessarily have to shoot. So that's how they can operate here as well. As for the Lyman direction itself, in this context I would mention the Seversky sector, where unfortunately the enemy is advancing in the Serebransky forest area. Unfortunately, they've managed to bring a significant part of it under their control. And if the enemy advances and gets closer to Dranivka, you should look at the map to see where this settlement is, then Siversk will be in danger. Basically, that's the nape of this settlement. If the enemy gets in, right now, Siversk is already in a sort of pocket. If the advance continues, it could easily be considered a semi-encirclement. And Siversk is quite an important, let's say, settlement and defensive area in the Lyman direction. And further enemy advances in the Lyman direction threaten to reach the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration from the north. So, for example, Kostiantynivka, Toretsk, the Kostiantynivka axis, that's a possible offensive towards Slavyansk-Kramatorsk from the south. And the Lyman direction is from the north. So that's the kind of danger that could happen there.
And here's another point, Dennis. You briefly mentioned, yes, the strengthening of our negotiating positions. And here's something recent. Yes, Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine struck logistics facilities of the Russian Federation Army in temporarily occupied Crimea. This was reported by the command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. As a result, logistics facilities that support the operation and combat supply of Russian military units were put out of commission. Let me remind you that in the morning, the sounds of explosions were heard in the settlement of Krasnogvardiskoye and Zankoy. This was reported by local social media channels. A few days ago, a fuel train was already attacked in the city. At that time, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces confirmed a strike on the railway station in Zankoy. But this isn't the only successful visit by our defenders. The Asluga port, yes, and accordingly, a company involved in gas processing and the transportation of energy resources for the Russian Federation was affected there. In fact, the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery, which burned for 5 whole days, the Russians barely managed to put it out. And all this is happening against the backdrop of emerging information and new data about our Flamingo missile, about the long-range Neptune missile. And, well, this increases, let's say, the factors that work in our favor in potentially possible peace negotiations. How would you comment on these latest strikes and, in fact, the new data about our weapons?
Well, Zankoe is a key railway junction in Crimea. That is, if you recall, no matter which direction the trains come from when heading to Crimea, whether from the direction of Mykolaiv, Kherson, or from Melitopol, they all still pass through Zankoe. So, it's probably the main junction, and the practice of striking railway junctions, both in the occupied territories, particularly in temporarily occupied Crimea, and on the territory of the Russian Federation, has become very common lately. In other words, strikes on railway junctions create major gaps in logistics, causing dozens of trains to be delayed both in Russia and in the occupied territories. This disrupts the train schedules and, to some extent, affects logistics, especially frontline logistics, since we know that the enemy mainly relies on railways to build their supply chains. So that's one factor. Now, moving on. It's no coincidence that we target trains carrying fuel, so we're not just cutting off fuel supplies to a certain part of the front, we're also seriously disrupting logistics. Just imagine a huge train full of tank cars, all loaded with fuel. It's on fire. Yeah, first you have to put it out, then deal with the aftermath of that blaze, that fire. Fix the railroad tracks, which are sure to be seriously damaged as a result of that fire. So, that's at least a few days, right? If not more. And of course, that also has a major impact on logistics. Plus, you mentioned strikes on oil refineries. Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery, then the Volgograd refinery, the Syzran refinery, you could keep listing them. According to Reuters calculations, 17% of oil refining capacity has been taken out of operation in the Russian Federation. Now, all over the Russian Federation and in the occupied territories, there's no gasoline at the gas stations. It's just not there. So, in some cases, it's already being sold with ration cards, with coupons. They're only letting it go that way, right? And only for the needs of local authorities, utility services, and so on. So these are, let's say, the consequences of these strikes on the refineries and on logistics. The effects are already clear. So, the best sanctions are actually the actions of the Ukrainian defense forces against these targets. And in this regard, the information about the Flamingo missile, which, let me remind you, has a range of up to 3,000 kilometers, which is actually beyond the Urals, means it could be. It will be very effective precisely for striking these unprotected targets, such as oil refineries, oil depots, and key stations. There are a lot of these targets, and it's simply not possible for air defense systems to protect them all.
Also, in the temporarily occupied Donetsk region, in the city of Makiivka, drones attacked late in the evening. So, the occupation administration there claimed that the strike targeted warehouses. But in reality, it's unclear exactly which facilities they were referring to. What do you think could have been valuable there?
I don't have any information about what might be there either. Well, warehouses can hold just about anything. If there was a secondary detonation, which, unfortunately, I can't confirm, then it could have been an ammunition depot.
Which, of course, would be a plus. Thank you very much, Dennis, for taking the time to join us and be part of our broadcast.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.